In April of 1973, a man walked up to a phone, dialed the police, and calmly told them that he had been responsible for multiple murders. Not just one, several. He gave details, locations, descriptions that no one else could have known. And when officers arrived, he didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply waited. But what makes this case so unsettling is not just what he did, it's how long he lived a normal life while doing it, and how no one truly suspected him. Imagine this for a moment. Someone around you, someone who speaks calmly, who seems intelligent, who blends into everyday life, is hiding something unimaginable. How would you ever know? Edmund Kemper was not someone who easily went unnoticed. He stood over 6 feet tall, soft-spoken, intelligent. He could hold conversations. He could appear thoughtful, even polite. But behind that calm exterior was something far more complex. He was born in 1948 in California. From an early age, his life was shaped by tension, particularly within his family. His relationship with his mother was strained, deeply strained. She was described as strict, controlling, critical. And over time, that relationship began to affect him in ways that would only become clear later. As he grew older, his behavior escalated. At the age of 15, he committed his first murders. Not strangers, not random victims, members of his own family. He killed his grandparents, and after that, something unexpected happened. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't run. He called his mother and told her what he had done. Now think about that for a moment. What goes through someone's mind when they commit something like that and then calmly report it? He was arrested and later evaluated by psychiatrists. They determined that he was mentally unstable, that he required treatment, and instead of being sent to prison, he was committed to a psychiatric facility. There, something else happened. He began to appear normal. He cooperated. He followed rules. He participated in evaluations. He even assisted doctors in understanding other patients. Over time, professionals began to believe that he had improved, that he was no longer a threat, and eventually he was released. Now think about this carefully. If someone commits serious violence at a young age and later appears stable, how do you decide if they are truly safe? Because that decision would change everything. After his release, Edmund Kemper returned to society. He got a job. He interacted with people. He built a life that, on the surface, looked normal. But beneath that surface, something remained. And over time, it would resurface. He began picking up hitchhikers, young women, college students. At first, it seemed harmless, a ride, a conversation. But for some of them, it would be the last ride they ever took. We'll come back to how he gained their trust, because that's one of the most disturbing parts of this case. And as the pattern continued, the question became not just how he was doing it, but how he managed to do it without being suspected for so long. Because even as people around him lived their lives, a pattern was forming. One that would only become visible after it was too late. After his release, Edmund Kemper returned to California. and began building what looked like an ordinary life. He found work. He socialized. He spoke calmly, often intelligently, with the people around him. And over time, he learned something important: how to appear harmless. Because despite his size and presence, he understood that trust was something he could create. He spent time around law enforcement, at bars where police officers gathered. He listened, observed, learned how investigations worked, and that gave him an advantage. Now, think about this. If someone understands how police think, how they investigate, does that make it easier for them to avoid suspicion? Because while everything on the surface appeared normal, a pattern had already begun. He started picking up hitchhikers along highways, young women, often college students, looking for rides. At the time, hitchhiking was more common. People trusted strangers more easily, and Kemper knew exactly how to use that. He would appear calm, polite, non-threatening, and for a moment, everything would seem safe. But that safety didn't last. One by one, victims began disappearing. At first, there was no clear connection, different locations, different circumstances. But behind the scenes, there was a consistent method. He would gain their trust, offer them a ride, and once they were inside the car, the situation would change. We won't go into graphic detail, but what followed was controlled, deliberate, and repeated. And with each incident, he became more confident. Now, think about this carefully. If someone gets away with something once, does that make it easier for them to do it again? Because in this case, it did. As time passed, he continued his routine, picking up victims, maintaining a normal outward life, blending into everyday society. And perhaps the most unsettling part was how close he was to people who could have stopped him. He interacted with law enforcement, had conversations with officers, even discussed cases, all while hiding what he was doing. That creates a disturbing question. How often do dangerous people exist in plain sight? Eventually, investigators began to notice patterns, missing persons, locations, timelines, but nothing pointed directly to him. There were no immediate witnesses, no direct evidence connecting him. He remained invisible. Until something changed. Because over time, his actions escalated, and the focus of his behavior shifted. It moved closer to the one relationship that had defined much of his life: his mother. Their relationship had always been strained, filled with tension, arguments, resentment that had built over years, and eventually, that tension reached a breaking point. One night, inside their home, something happened. Kemper later admitted that he killed his mother. The act itself marked a turning point, not just in what he had done,
but in what came next. Because after that, there was no longer any separation between his past and his present. Everything had collided. Now think about this. If someone commits multiple crimes and manages to hide them, what finally pushes them to stop? Is it fear of being caught, guilt, or something else entirely? After killing his mother, Kemper's behavior changed. He no longer continued the pattern he had followed before. Instead, he made a decision. He left, traveled, put distance between himself and everything he had done. But even then, he didn't try to disappear completely. He didn't create a new identity. He didn't attempt to live a hidden life. Instead, he reached a point where he did something unexpected. He called the police. At first, they didn't believe him, because the idea that someone would calmly confess after avoiding detection for so long didn't seem real. But he insisted, repeated details, provided information, and eventually they realized he was telling the truth. Now think about this carefully. Why would someone who successfully avoided capture suddenly choose to confess? Was it a need for control, a desire to end it, or something deeper that we can't fully understand? When authorities took him into custody, he didn't resist. He cooperated, spoke openly, explained what he had done. And just like that, the hidden pattern that had gone unnoticed for so long was exposed. But even with his confession, questions remained, because understanding what happened is not the same as understanding why, and that why is often the hardest part. We'll come back to what happened after his arrest, because the way this case concludes is different from most others, not just in what was revealed, but in how it continues to be studied even today. Because this is not just a case about actions, it's a case about the mind behind them. And what it reveals is something that still unsettles people. After his arrest, Edmund Kemper did something that set him apart from many other cases. He didn't deny what he had done. He didn't try to shift blame. Instead, he spoke. In long, detailed interviews, he described his actions, his thoughts, and the patterns that had driven him. To investigators, to psychologists, to anyone trying to understand what had happened. And that created a different kind of case, because this wasn't just about solving a crime anymore. It became about studying behavior, trying to understand how someone could live a normal life on the surface while hiding something so extreme beneath it. Now think about this. If someone appears calm, intelligent, even cooperative, does that make them easier to trust or more dangerous? Kemper was eventually convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms in prison. And even after that, he continued to talk. He participated in interviews, helped law enforcement understand patterns, provided insights into criminal behavior. Some investigators even used his cooperation to better understand other cases, which raises another difficult question. Can someone who has committed serious crimes still contribute something useful afterward? Or does that not matter at all? Over time, his case became one of the most studied in criminal psychology, not just because of what he did, but because of how he explained it. The contrast between his calm demeanor and his actions is what continues to unsettle people, because it challenges a common belief that danger is always obvious, that you can always recognize it. But cases like this suggest something else, that sometimes it isn't visible at all. And that's what makes it harder to understand. So now think about this. If someone like him could exist unnoticed for so long, how many others might have passed through everyday life without raising suspicion? And one more thing to consider. When someone chooses to confess after everything, do you see that as acceptance of responsibility or just another form of control? Because in the end, this case leaves behind more than just a timeline. It leaves behind a question about human behavior itself. Not just what people do, but how well we really understand them.
of December 24th, 2002, a pregnant woman went missing from her home in Modesto, California. Her name was Laci Peterson. She was 8 months pregnant. By the end of that day, she had not returned home. By the end of the week, the case had drawn national attention. By the end of the following year, it would become one of the most closely watched trials in the United States. Laci Peterson was 27 years old. She lived with her husband, Scott Peterson, in a modest home in Modesto. Friends described Laci as warm, social, and close to her family. She was excited about becoming a mother. The couple had planned to name their son Connor. On December 24th, Laci was last known to be at home. According to Scott Peterson, he left the house that morning to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, several hours away. He later stated that when he left, Laci was at home preparing for the day. She was wearing maternity clothes. She had plans to walk the family dog and finish household tasks. That afternoon, when Scott returned home, Laci was gone. The dog was found wandering outside, still wearing its leash. Laci's car was parked at the house. Her personal belongings were inside. Scott contacted Laci's family and later reported her missing. Police arrived and began a search. At first, the case was treated as a missing person investigation. Search teams canvassed the neighborhood. Volunteers assisted. Flyers were distributed. There were no confirmed sightings of Laci after that morning. As days passed, investigators began examining Scott Peterson's account more closely. His fishing trip drew attention. The Berkeley Marina was far from Modesto, and the trip occurred on Christmas Eve. Scott stated that he had decided to fish because he had the day off. Receipts and parking records later confirmed that Scott had been in the area he claimed. However, questions remained. Why travel so far alone on a holiday? Why leave a pregnant wife at home? Investigators also uncovered information about Scott's personal life. Scott had been involved in an extramarital relationship. The woman later stated that Scott told her he had lost his wife and that this would be his first Christmas without her. This statement was made before Laci Peterson was reported missing. When this information became public, the direction of the investigation changed. Scott Peterson became the focus of intense scrutiny. Media attention increased rapidly. Search efforts expanded beyond Modesto. As weeks turned into months, no trace of Laci was found. Then, in April 2003, human remains were discovered along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay. The remains were later identified as those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The location of the remains was near the area where Scott Peterson had gone fishing. At that point, the case moved from a missing person investigation to a homicide. Scott Peterson was arrested and charged with murder. The case would soon move into the courtroom, where evidence, timelines, and interpretations would be examined in detail. As investigators focused more closely on Scott Peterson, the case began to change in tone. What had started as a community search for a missing pregnant woman became a carefully examined timeline of movements, statements, and inconsistencies. Scott Peterson told police that on the morning Laci disappeared, he left the house around 9:30 a.m. He said Laci was watching television and planned to mop the floor before walking the dog. He drove several hours to the Berkeley Marina, where he launched a small boat and went fishing alone. Receipts, parking records, and witness statements later confirmed that Scott had been in the marina area that day. This fact became central to the case, not because it disproved his story, but because of where Lacey and her unborn son would later be found. While police continued to search for Lacey, Scott Peterson's personal life drew increasing attention. Investigators learned about his relationship with another woman, Amber Fry. Amber later told police that Scott had informed her in early December that he had lost his wife and that this would be his first Christmas without her. At the time he made those statements, Lacey Peterson was still alive. When Amber Fry came forward publicly, media coverage intensified. Scott Peterson became the focus of constant attention. His behavior was closely analyzed. Every interview, every public appearance, every word he spoke was scrutinized. Some observers described him as calm to the point of detachment. Others argued that reactions to stress vary and should not be interpreted as evidence. Law enforcement continued building a case based largely on circumstantial evidence. There were no eyewitnesses to a crime, no confession, no direct forensic evidence tying Scott Peterson to Lacey's death. Instead, prosecutors focused on patterns. They examined Scott's movements on the day of Lacey's disappearance. They reviewed phone records and computer searches. They reconstructed timelines. When Lacey and Connor's remains were discovered in April 2003 along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay, investigators noted their proximity to the Berkeley Marina. As this geographic connection became a cornerstone of the prosecution's theory, the condition of the remains indicated that they had been in the water for several months. Medical examiners could not determine an exact cause of death. The absence of clear trauma meant that many questions remained unanswered. Despite these uncertainties, prosecutors moved forward. Scott Peterson was charged with 2 counts of murder. The trial began in 2004 and quickly became a national event. Court proceedings were followed closely by the media. Every detail was debated. Prosecutors argued that Scott Peterson killed Lacey and Connor and disposed of their bodies in the bay. They pointed to Scott's extramarital affair, his statements to Amber Fry, and his actions in the days following Lacey's disappearance. They emphasized the location of the remains and Scott's fishing trip. The defense countered that the case relied entirely on circumstantial evidence. They argued that no physical evidence placed Lacey in Scott's boat. They suggested alternative explanations, including the possibility that Lacey had been abducted while walking the dog. Witnesses were called to testify about sightings of a pregnant woman walking a dog in the neighborhood on the morning of December 24th. These accounts were contested. Some witnesses were deemed unreliable. Others were questioned about timing and distance. The jury was tasked with evaluating a case built on inference rather than direct proof. After months of testimony, deliberations began. The jury found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Lacey Peterson and second-degree murder in the death of their unborn son. He was sentenced to death. Years later, the sentence would be overturned due to issues related to jury selection, though the conviction itself was upheld. Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Throughout the legal process, debate surrounding the case never fully subsided. Supporters of the verdict argued that the evidence, taken as a whole, pointed clearly to guilt. Others continued to question whether the standard of proof had been met. The case became a lasting example of how circumstantial evidence can both convince and divide. Lacey Peterson's disappearance began quietly on a holiday morning. It ended in a courtroom years later with a verdict that closed the case legally, but not emotionally. For many, the story remains unsettling, not because of unanswered questions, but because of how ordinary it seemed at the start. A walk with a dog, a quiet house, a day that was supposed to be routine. And then, nothing. As the legal process concluded, the Laci Peterson case entered a different phase. The courtroom proceedings were over. The verdict had been delivered. The appeals process continued, but the central outcome did not change. Scott Peterson would spend the rest of his life in prison. For Laci Peterson's family, the verdict marked an end to the legal chapter of the case, but not to the loss itself. Laci and her unborn son, Connor, were remembered as individuals rather than evidence. They were mourned as people whose lives were taken before they could continue. The case remained present in public memory long after the trial. It was revisited in documentaries, articles, and discussions about circumstantial evidence. Some viewed it as a clear example of how patterns and timelines can establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Others continued to debate whether the absence of direct physical evidence left room for doubt. The legal system, however, had reached its conclusion. What makes the Laci Peterson case endure is not only the crime itself, but the way it unfolded. It began quietly, without witnesses or obvious signs of violence. It moved slowly, built on inference and reconstruction. And it ended not with certainty for everyone, but with a verdict that forced the public to confront how justice is determined when answers are incomplete. Laci Peterson did not disappear in the middle of the night or in a remote location. She vanished on a familiar street, in her own neighborhood, on a morning that was meant to be ordinary. That ordinariness is part of what unsettles people. It suggests how quickly normal routines can fracture. In the years since, the case has often been referenced in discussions about media influence, public opinion, and the pressure surrounding high-profile trials. But beneath those discussions remains a simpler reality. A young woman who was preparing to become a mother did not get that chance. A child named Connor never had a life outside the courtroom narrative built around his death. And a family was left with a loss that no verdict could undo. Late at night, when stories like this are played quietly, they are rarely about reliving the details. They are about understanding how events move from everyday moments into permanent consequences. They are about recognizing how much of life depends on trust, routine, and the expectation that tomorrow will arrive as planned. The Laci Peterson case reached an ending that many cases never do. But even with a legal resolution, it continues to linger. Not because of spectacle, but because of the space between what can be proven and what can never be fully known. If you've listened through this case, you've followed it from a missing person report to a courtroom verdict. If a particular detail stayed with you, or if something in the timeline stood out, you're welcome to share it. Quiet reflection and discussion are often how cases like this remain understood rather than forgotten. If this calm, late-night approach to true crime is something you return to, more documented cases will follow. There is no urgency, no final note meant to provoke. Just another story, carefully examined, before the night continues.
The Night Stalker. The summer Los Angeles stopped sleeping. In the summer of 1985, Los Angeles stopped sleeping. Windows that once stayed open for night air were shut tight despite the heat. Porch lights remained on until sunrise. Gun sales increased. Neighbors began checking on one another before bed. The city did not know his name yet. They only knew the pattern. He came after midnight. He entered quietly, and he chose houses at random. The first confirmed killing connected to what would become known as the Night Stalker occurred in 1984, but it was in 1985 that fear truly spread. Victims ranged in age from young adults to the elderly. Some lived alone, some with spouses, some in modest homes, others in middle-class neighborhoods. There was no clear profile, no consistent income bracket, no predictable district, just entry through unlocked doors or windows, and then violence. He often approached on foot, dark clothing, sometimes a baseball cap, sometimes gloves. He carried firearms or knives depending on the night. He moved through houses like a shadow, silent until he wasn't. The randomness was what paralyzed Los Angeles. If criminals target specific neighborhoods, people adjust. If they target specific demographics, people rationalize. But when victims appear unrelated, when geography stretches across counties, fear multiplies. In March 1985, an elderly woman was murdered in her home. No forced entry. The attack was brutal. Weeks later, another elderly victim, then another. In some cases, jewelry was taken. In others, nothing of value disappeared. Sometimes there were signs of ritualistic behavior. Sometimes strange symbols were left behind. But at first, detectives did not immediately connect the crimes. Los Angeles in the mid-1980s was vast and fragmented. Jurisdictions overlapped. Sheriff's departments handled some areas. City police handled others. Patterns are harder to see when data is scattered. It was only as cases accumulated that similarities emerged. Victims were often attacked while asleep. Windows left open for ventilation during warm nights. Windows cracked open. Air conditioning was less common. The killer exploited routine. He watched neighborhoods in advance, studied which homes went dark first, which houses lacked security bars, which bedrooms faced side yards. He preferred darkness over confrontation, surprise over struggle. In one attack, a couple was assaulted in their bedroom. In another, a single woman. In yet another, an elderly man shot while asleep. The method varied slightly. The intrusion did not. The media began using the name the Night Stalker. The label intensified panic because it suggested someone moving through the city deliberately, someone hunting. Law enforcement faced mounting pressure. The killer left behind limited physical evidence. In one instance, a shoe print was recovered, an uncommon brand, size 11, Avia sneaker. That detail would later become critical, but at the time, it was just a clue without a face. In some crime scenes, investigators noted symbols drawn, pentagrams or references to satanic imagery. This fueled media frenzy. Talk radio amplified fear. Rumors spread. Parents forbade teenagers from staying out late. Security companies advertised aggressively. Gun ranges filled with first-time buyers. Los Angeles in 1985 was already grappling with crime waves and gang activity, but this was different. This was intimate. Home invasion erodes the illusion of safety more deeply than street crime. It reaches into bedrooms, into moments of vulnerability. Late at night, when ceiling fans turn slowly and houses cool down, silence becomes noticeable. That summer, silence became suspicious. In July 1985, a fingerprint was lifted from a stolen vehicle connected to one of the crimes. The print belonged to Richard Ramirez. He was 25 years old, a drifter, born in Texas, raised in an unstable household, exposed early to violence and disturbing influences. He had moved to California in his early 20s, living transiently, hotels, friends' couches, cheap apartments. He had prior arrests for theft and drug possession, but nothing that prepared the public for what would unfold.
Before his identity was known publicly, Ramirez continued attacking. Victims described a thin man with dark hair, sunken eyes, a strong odor, poor dental hygiene that some later recalled vividly. He sometimes demanded money, sometimes jewelry, sometimes simply entered and attacked without prolonged interaction. In certain attacks, he forced victims to swear allegiance to Satan. These details, reported widely, intensified media sensationalism. But beyond the shock value, the core pattern remained. He chose unlocked entries. He struck between midnight and 4 a.m. He fled before neighbors could react, and he left entire households terrified. The police began coordinating more aggressively between jurisdictions. Task forces formed. Ballistics reports linked firearms used in multiple attacks. The Avia shoe print appeared at several scenes. Detectives canvassed shoe stores, tracked recent purchases. The brand was not widely distributed. It narrowed possibilities. But Los Angeles County holds millions of residents. The field was still vast. In late July 1985, 2 elderly women were attacked in Monterey Park. One survived. She provided a description that matched earlier witness accounts. The composite sketch circulated rapidly. It was broadcast on television, printed in newspapers, distributed to patrol officers. For the first time, the city saw a face. Thin, dark eyes, angular features. The effect was immediate. Tips flooded in, but many were false. Paranoia can distort identification. People began seeing the Night Stalker everywhere, in grocery stores, on buses, at gas stations. The real Richard Ramirez continued moving quietly, sleeping during the day, walking at night, sometimes taking public transportation, sometimes hitchhiking. He did not fit a polished criminal profile. He was erratic, addicted to cocaine, prone to impulsive decisions. But at night, he demonstrated focus, selection, entry, exit. In August 1985, a major break occurred. Ramirez left behind a fingerprint on the rearview mirror of a stolen Toyota. This time, it was clear. The print matched one already in the system from a previous arrest. His name became public: Richard Ramirez. The Night Stalker had a face and a record. Police released his mugshot. Television stations aired it repeatedly. Newspapers printed it on front pages. The city's fear shifted from unknown predator to known fugitive. But that did not reduce danger. It intensified the hunt. Once the name Richard Ramirez was released to the public in August 1985, Los Angeles shifted from fear to pursuit. His face was everywhere.
Television broadcasts interrupted programming with updates. Newspapers printed his mugshot in bold ink. Radio hosts repeated the name hourly. The anonymity that had protected him vanished overnight. But before the identification became public, the violence had escalated. In the weeks leading up to the reveal, Ramirez attacked repeatedly. Couples shot in their beds, women assaulted in living rooms, elderly victims beaten without warning. He did not follow a strict victim type. Age ranged widely, neighborhoods varied, income levels differed. This randomness made profiling difficult. The Avia shoe print continued appearing at scenes. Detectives tracked distribution records and learned that only a limited number of that specific model had been sold in the Los Angeles area. It was not mass-produced. The rarity helped narrow investigative focus, but it did not immediately produce a suspect. Then came the fingerprint, lifted from the rearview mirror of a stolen vehicle abandoned after one of the attacks. The print was clear, strong, undeniable. It matched an existing record for Ramirez from a previous arrest. For the first time, they had more than pattern. They had identity. But Ramirez did not know immediately that his name had gone public. He continued moving as if still invisible, staying in cheap motels, visiting acquaintances, traveling by bus between neighborhoods. When he finally saw his face on television in late August 1985, the manhunt shifted into something volatile. Los Angeles was no longer just frightened, it was alert and angry. Residents began watching strangers more closely. The composite sketch had already created suspicion. Now the confirmed photo made recognition possible. On August 30th, 1985, Ramirez returned to Los Angeles after a brief trip to Arizona. He stepped off a bus at the Greyhound terminal downtown. He did not yet know that his image was on every news broadcast. As he walked through East Los Angeles, residents recognized him almost immediately. Someone shouted, another pointed. Within minutes, a crowd began forming. This was not organized law enforcement. This was spontaneous public reaction. People chased him through streets. He attempted to carjack a vehicle. The driver fought back. He was struck by bystanders, beaten, held down until police arrived. The man who had stalked sleeping homes was captured in day broadlight by the very city he had terrorized. The image of his arrest became symbolic, not just police capturing a fugitive, but a community responding collectively. When officers arrived, Ramirez was bloodied but alive. He smiled at cameras, raised a hand with a pentagram drawn on it during court appearances later. But at the moment of arrest, the panic in Los Angeles began to shift into relief. Still, relief does not erase trauma. The list of victims was long. More than a dozen murders, multiple sexual assaults, numerous attempted killings. Survivors carried permanent scars, physical and psychological. Ramirez's pattern exploited something simple: unlocked windows during warm nights, routine, trust in domestic space. He did not need elaborate planning. He needed opportunity. He walked neighborhoods looking for vulnerability. A window slightly open, a door without deadbolt. He entered quietly, often through a rear entrance, sometimes by climbing. He moved through homes with surprising calm, demanding money in some cases, assaulting without warning in others. There was no consistent script. That unpredictability amplified fear. Some attacks included forced declarations of satanic allegiance. Ramirez embraced the label publicly after media began reporting it. He leaned into the image. Courtroom theatrics would come later, but during the summer itself, the horror was less theatrical. It was domestic. A husband shot beside his wife, an elderly woman beaten in her sleep.
A child awakened by gunfire. The avia shoe became a symbol in its own right. Investigators distributed bulletins asking store owners about recent purchases. They cross-referenced receipts, interviewed clerks. The shoe print tied multiple scenes together conclusively. Without it, the crimes may have remained fragmented. Different jurisdictions might not have connected them as quickly. In the aftermath of his capture, law enforcement reviewed each scene meticulously. Ballistics evidence confirmed links between shootings. Fingerprint matches tied him to burglaries. Stolen items recovered. The picture sharpened. But for the residents of Los Angeles, the sharper image did not erase the months of fear. Parents remembered keeping lights on all night. Neighbors remembered forming informal watch groups. Some residents slept with weapons beside their beds. Security bars were installed across thousands of windows that year. Home alarm companies saw record demand. The Night Stalker had changed physical architecture in parts of the city. Metal bars became common in neighborhoods that previously left windows open. The psychological shift lasted longer than the crime spree. Late at night, the echo of that summer still feels present in the story. Because what Ramirez exploited was not wealth or poverty, it was routine. The assumption that midnight belongs to sleep, that windows can remain open for breeze, that quiet neighborhoods stay quiet. He moved between communities without prejudice, selecting houses based on accessibility rather than status, and that randomness created universal vulnerability. When the manhunt concluded with his capture, the city exhaled. But closure is never immediate. Each victim represented a separate rupture. Each surviving family carried memory into the future. And the city itself retained a lesson about darkness. To understand how the summer of 1985 unfolded the way it did, investigators eventually turned to the early life of Richard Ramirez. He was born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His childhood was marked by instability, violence, and exposure to disturbing influences at a young age. One of the most frequently cited influences was an older cousin, a Vietnam War veteran who reportedly shared graphic stories of violence and combat. There were accounts that this cousin showed Ramirez photographs depicting brutality from the war. In at least one documented incident, the cousin shot his wife in front of Ramirez during an argument. Exposure to violence during formative years does not predetermine criminal behavior, but repeated exposure without stability can distort boundaries between imagination and action. By adolescence, he had already begun engaging in petty theft and drug use. He dropped out of school, moved frequently, drifted. His criminal record prior to the Night Stalker murders included burglary and narcotics charges. He was not a model citizen, but he was not yet publicly known as a violent offender. When he relocated to California in the early 1980s, he lived transiently. Cheap motels, friends' couches, occasional day labor. He developed a cocaine addiction. Substance use fueled erratic behavior, but also extended wakefulness, useful for someone who preferred to move at night.
Ramirez did not conform to a single psychological category. He did not exclusively target one age group. He did not confine himself to one neighborhood. This unpredictability made profiling difficult. Many serial offenders demonstrate narrow patterns, specific victim types or locations. Ramirez's pattern was broader. His common denominator was vulnerability, unlocked doors, accessible windows, sleeping occupants. He exploited opportunity rather than personal grievance. The satanic symbolism reported at several scenes drew intense media focus. Pentagrams carved on skin or drawn on walls. Verbal references to Satan. In court later, he would flash a pentagram on his palm. But psychological experts have debated how much of this represented belief versus performance. Some argue that he adopted the symbolism as an identity, something dramatic and fear-inducing. Others believe it reflected a genuine fascination. Regardless of motivation, it amplified terror, because it transformed burglary into something ritualistic in public perception. But beneath the symbols, the core remained intrusion and violence. In many cases, he shot victims first to neutralize resistance. In others, he used knives or blunt force. Sexual assault occurred in several attacks, but not all. There was no singular script. The inconsistency itself increased unpredictability. Late at night, when ceiling fans spin and houses settle into silence, the randomness of his selection feels most unsettling. He did not stalk one person over months. He stalked entire neighborhoods, walking streets after midnight, observing which homes were dark, testing doors, lifting screens quietly. He carried firearms when available. If not, he used knives. If not, he used objects within reach. Improvisation was part of his pattern. The Avia shoe print was one of the few consistent physical markers tying multiple scenes together. Investigators traced the shoe model to a limited retail distribution. When his arrest occurred, police found shoes matching the print in his possession. That link strengthened the chain of evidence. After his capture, detectives revisited earlier unsolved cases. Some earlier murders were reclassified as connected. The scope expanded. Ramirez's crime spree spanned roughly 14 months. The summer of 1985 was its most intense phase, but the fear it generated lasted far longer. Psychologically, Ramirez exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder: lack of remorse, manipulation, impulsivity. He reportedly smiled in court, made dramatic gestures, attempted to control the narrative. But courtroom performance is often superficial. The deeper pattern lies in behavior. He chose times when occupants were most vulnerable. He avoided confrontation during daylight. He fled quickly after assaults. He did not linger long at scenes beyond what was necessary to assert control. Despite media portrayals that leaned heavily into satanic imagery, the core behavior was opportunistic home invasion combined with extreme violence. That combination destabilizes communities because it turns the private sphere, the bedroom, into a site of fear. Los Angeles in 1985 became a case study in how serial crime reshapes urban behavior. Window bars increased. Neighborhood watch groups expanded.
Gun ownership rose. Even after his arrest, many residents kept lights on overnight for months. The Night Stalker became shorthand for vulnerability in darkness.
For the victims' families, media attention offered little comfort. Names became headlines, faces circulated, but grief is not reduced by national awareness. Each home invasion was its own world shattered. Each survivor carried memories that extended far beyond the summer. In the broader narrative of American serial crime, Ramirez occupies a distinct place, not because he was the most methodical, not because he had the highest victim count, but because his attacks were spread across such a vast urban area in such a short time. The city felt under siege, and siege implies collective threat. After the arrest of Richard Ramirez in August 1985, Los Angeles did not immediately return to normal. Relief is not the same as restoration. The fear that had spread across neighborhoods did not evaporate overnight. Windows remained locked even during heat waves. Security bars stayed installed. Porch lights burned until dawn. The Night Stalker had changed behavior patterns permanently. For months, residents had gone to sleep wondering if their home would be the next one chosen at random. That randomness was the most destabilizing element. He did not confine himself to one block. He did not follow a predictable demographic pattern. He did not limit his victims by age. Children, elderly couples, young adults, anyone whose door or window offered opportunity. After his capture, police re-examined earlier unsolved burglaries and homicides across the region. Ballistics reports linked multiple shootings. Fingerprints confirmed connections. Stolen jewelry and personal items recovered from his possessions strengthened the chain of evidence. The shoe print, the size 11 Avia, remained one of the most significant physical anchors tying scenes together. Without that print, the crimes might have remained fragmented across jurisdictions. Instead, it became a symbol of the investigation's turning point. During trial proceedings, Ramirez embraced notoriety. He flashed satanic symbols in court, smiled at cameras, attempted to project defiance. But courtroom theatrics do not change the pattern of behavior that defined the spree. The true weight of the case rests not in headlines, but in households. Bedrooms, once considered private, became scenes of violence. Couples who had slept with windows open for decades began installing steel bars. Entire neighborhoods coordinated informal patrols. The summer of 1985 entered collective memory as the season when Los Angeles did not sleep. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the most unsettling realization is how little separated safety from danger. An unlocked window, a thin screen, a sliding door without reinforcement. That was often enough. He did not rely on complex planning. He relied on accessibility. And accessibility exists in every city. In many serial cases, victims share characteristics. In this case, what they shared was vulnerability in routine. Sleeping, trusting the quiet, believing the door was secure enough. The cultural impact extended beyond Los Angeles. National news amplified the fear. Other cities reviewed cold cases. Homeowners across the country reconsidered security habits. The term Night Stalker entered popular vocabulary as shorthand for unseen threat after midnight. Yet beneath the media narrative lies a simpler and heavier truth. Lives ended violently in spaces meant for rest. Survivors carried trauma forward. Families rebuilt without answers that could restore what was lost. The randomness remains the defining feature. If there had been a clear grievance, fear might have been localized, but randomness dissolves boundaries. It tells every household, you could be next. That is why the case still resonates decades later. Not because of satanic symbols, not because of courtroom spectacle, but because it targeted the universal human need for safety in sleep. When the city captured him, not just police, but residents who recognized and chased him, it symbolized something larger, a community pushing back against prolonged fear. Yet fear leaves residue. Even after sentencing, even after incarceration, even after years passed, security bars remained on many windows installed that summer. The architecture of Los Angeles changed subtly because of him, and architecture is memory in metal. The Night Stalker case stands as a reminder that vulnerability often lies in routine, in small decisions, in habits repeated nightly, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators rely not on complexity, but on opportunity. When lights go out and houses settle, the illusion of safety feels natural. But in the summer of 1985, Los Angeles learned that illusion can fracture quietly. One window, one step inside, one city holding its breath. Thank you for listening.
Night of June 9th, 1912, the town of Villisca, Iowa, went to sleep as it always had. The streets were unpaved, the air carried the scent of livestock and summer grass. Front doors were often left unlocked. Neighbors knew one another by name. Nothing about that Sunday evening suggested it would become one of the most haunting nights in American criminal history. Josiah Moore, a respected businessman, had spent the evening attending Children's Day exercises at the Presbyterian Church with his wife, Sarah, and their 4 children. The event had ended around 9:30 p.m. It had been cheerful. Children singing, community gathering, lantern light flickering softly. 2 sisters, Ina and Lena Stillinger, had been invited to spend the night at the Moore home after the church event. It was common in a town like Villisca. Parents trusted neighbors. Children moved freely between homes. Around 10 p.m., the Moore family and their guests returned to the modest white house on East 2nd Street. The house was narrow, 2 stories, a small attic above, bedrooms arranged tightly along the upper level. That night, 8 people slept inside. By morning, all 8 would be dead. Sometime after midnight, while the town was silent and dark, someone entered the Moore home. There were no signs of forced entry. Investigators later believed the killer may have hidden inside the house before the family returned from church. Or he may have entered quietly after they had gone to sleep. What is certain is this: the killer carried an axe. The weapon was later identified as belonging to Josiah Moore himself, kept in the shed behind the house. That detail has always lingered. The murderer did not bring his own weapon. He used what was already there. The first victims were Josiah and Sarah Moore. They slept in a bedroom on the 2nd floor. The killer struck Josiah first. The blows were severe and repeated, more than necessary to ensure death. Then Sarah. Each victim was attacked in their beds. No evidence suggested prolonged struggle. The attacks were sudden, brutal, efficient. From there, the killer moved to the children's rooms. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul Moore, each struck with the blunt and sharp edge of the axe. The 2 sisters were killed in the guest room. Ina, 8 years old, Lena, 12. Lena may have partially awakened. Some evidence suggested defensive wounds on her arm.
But in the darkness, against an adult attacker wielding an axe, there was little chance of survival. What makes the Villisca murders uniquely unsettling is not only the violence, it is what happened after. The killer remained inside the house for some time. He covered mirrors with clothing. He draped sheets over the victims' faces. He washed his hands in a bowl in the kitchen. He left slabs of bacon on the stove. He ate food from the Moore pantry. And then, sometime before dawn, he vanished. The next morning, neighbors noticed something unusual. The Moore family had not begun their day. By 8 a.m., this was strange. By 9 a.m., it was alarming. Mary Peckham, a neighbor, knocked on the door. There was no answer. She tried again. Still silence. Eventually, Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, was called. He unlocked the door and entered the house. He climbed the stairs. What he saw has been described in reports as almost unrecognizable. The bodies were discovered in their beds, blood soaked through mattresses, walls splattered, sheets pulled tightly over faces. The house quickly filled with townspeople. Before law enforcement could secure the scene, dozens had walked through it. Neighbors moved through rooms, touched objects, stared. The sheriff, Hank Horton, arrived amidst the crowd, but rural law enforcement in 1912 had limited forensic tools. No DNA analysis, no fingerprint database of value, no crime scene containment protocol as we understand today. The axe was found in the guest room, leaning against a wall. It had been wiped partially clean. Bloody fingerprints may have been present, but there was no effective method to preserve them conclusively. Footprints were observed outside near the house. Some believed they led toward the railroad tracks, but by midday, so many curious townspeople had gathered that any tracks were indistinguishable. The news spread rapidly beyond Villisca. 8 people killed in a single household, bludgeoned with an axe. No robbery, no clear motive. It captured national headlines. Because this was not a city crime, not gang violence, not a drunken dispute. It was a quiet Midwestern home and a killer who entered silently.
Investigators began looking for suspects almost immediately. Suspicion fell first on transient men traveling by train, railroad workers, drifters. Villisca sat along a rail line. It was possible someone had arrived unnoticed, left unnoticed. Then suspicion turned inward. Josiah Moore had business rivals. He had once worked for a man named Frank Jones. There were rumors of tension between them. Some townspeople believed the murders were personal, targeted. Yet the brutality extended beyond Josiah. It included children, guests. The violence seemed excessive for a simple business dispute. As days passed, theories multiplied. Was it revenge, jealousy, mental illness, or something darker? One theory emerged that the killer had waited in the attic, listening, watching, descending only after the house was fully asleep. The attic showed signs of disturbance. A plate of food was found there, a cigarette butt, indicating someone may have hidden above. If true, it meant the killer was inside the house before the family returned from church, waiting, listening to their footsteps, hearing their evening conversations. The thought of that possibility has haunted the case for over a century because it changes the timeline from intrusion to infiltration, and infiltration suggests planning. The Villisca axe murders would become one of the most infamous unsolved mass murders in American history. But on that June morning in 1912, it was simply horror. A house that had been filled with children's laughter the night before now held 8 lifeless bodies. Lantern light replaced by daylight, exposing violence in full clarity. The killer was gone. No witnesses, no arrest, just silence. By noon on June 10, 1912, the house on East 2nd Street was no longer quiet. It was crowded.
Farmers who had heard the news left their fields and gathered near the property. Women wept openly on the sidewalk. Children were pulled indoors by frightened parents. Reporters began arriving from nearby towns by late afternoon. The sheriff attempted to maintain order, but in a town of barely 2,000 residents, shock overrode procedure. People entered the Moore home before law enforcement had fully documented the scene. Some walked upstairs, some touched furniture, some lifted sheets. Evidence that might have mattered was trampled. It would later be said that more than 100 people passed through the house before it was secured. In modern terms, the crime scene was contaminated beyond repair. Still, investigators worked with what they could. The axe was examined more carefully. It had belonged to Josiah Moore. The shed behind the Moore house suggested the killer likely retrieved it from the family's shed. That detail suggested familiarity with the property, or at least a willingness to explore it before entering the house. There were no signs of robbery. Money remained in Josiah's wallet. Valuables were untouched. The house had not been ransacked. This was not theft. This was something else. The positioning of the bodies raised further questions. The killer had struck victims primarily with the blunt end of the axe first, knocking them unconscious before using the blade. That detail indicated method rather than frenzy. It suggested control. After each killing, sheets were pulled over faces. Mirrors throughout the house were covered. Even a hanging mirror in the parlor was draped. Investigators could not determine why. Some speculated superstition. Others believed it was a way to avoid seeing reflections, perhaps even his own. The covered mirrors became one of the case's most unsettling details. They suggested the killer lingered after the murders, that he moved through the house deliberately, that he was not rushed. In the kitchen, a bowl of bloody water sat on a washstand. A towel nearby showed signs of use. The bacon left on the stove appeared partially cooked. Some investigators believed the killer had prepared food but abandoned it. Others believed he had eaten quietly before leaving. That detail, eating inside the home after committing multiple murders, disturbed even seasoned observers because it implied composure, a lack of urgency, a comfort inside a house filled with bodies. The first suspect who drew serious attention was a traveling minister named George Kelly. He had passed through Villisca days before the murders. He was known to be erratic. He had been seen peering into windows. He left town shortly after the killings. His behavior raised suspicion. Kelly was arrested months later. Under intense interrogation, he eventually confessed, but the confession was inconsistent. He claimed to have committed the murders in a daze. He described details that did not match the crime scene precisely. Some believed he had been coerced. Others believed he was mentally unstable and confessing falsely. At trial, his confession unraveled under scrutiny. There was no physical evidence placing him inside the Moore home. He was acquitted. The case returned to uncertainty. Meanwhile, attention shifted to Frank Jones, Josiah Moore's former employer. Jones was wealthy, influential, powerful within the community. Rumors suggested personal animosity between the two men. Some whispered about jealousy, others about business betrayal. There were allegations, never proven, that Jones had connections to hired killers, but no direct evidence tied him to the crime. The small-town environment amplified speculation. In Villisca, everyone knew everyone. Grudges were remembered, arguments were replayed. Over time, more than a dozen suspects were proposed: railroad workers, traveling salesmen, transient laborers. Some investigators theorized that the killer may have been a serial murderer traveling by train. Similar axe murders had occurred in other Midwestern towns around that period. Entire families killed in their beds. No robbery, no witnesses, axes found at the scene. The theory suggested a drifter moving along rail lines, selecting homes at random, entering after midnight, killing silently, and leaving before dawn.
But forensic science in 1912 could not conclusively link those crimes. They remained parallel suspicions rather than proven connections.
The Villisca murders lingered without resolution. Years passed. The Moore home remained standing. Visitors came to stare. The crime embedded itself into local folklore, but beneath folklore lay enduring questions. Why kill all 8 occupants? If Josiah Moore had been the primary target, why murder the children? Why kill the Stillinger sisters, guests who were not permanent members of the household? The scope of violence suggests either deep personal rage or total detachment. There was no sign of sexual assault conclusively documented, no ransom note, no political message, just execution. The methodical nature of the killings, room by room, suggests planning. The possibility that the killer hid in the attic before the family returned home adds another layer. If he waited there, he listened to them prepare for bed. He heard their evening routines. He knew exactly where they slept. He descended only after silence settled. The attic floor showed indentations, suggesting someone had lain there. A key ring belonging to Josiah Moore was found there as well. It had been removed from his pocket. Why place it there? Was it dropped accidentally? Was it symbolic? The absence of clear answers has allowed the Villisca axe murders to persist in American memory for over a century. Not because of courtroom drama, but because of unresolved intrusion. A killer inside a home, in darkness, without alarm, without capture. Late at night, when this story unfolds slowly, the house feels alive again. Creaking wooden floors, wind through thin window panes, 8 people sleeping under summer air, and somewhere inside, perhaps above them in the attic, someone waiting for the final lamp to go out, waiting for breathing to slow, waiting for silence, then descending. As weeks turned into months after the murders in Villisca, something more unsettling than violence settled over the town. It was uncertainty, the kind that does not fade. Because when a crime has no clear perpetrator, the fear does not attach to one person, it attaches to everyone. Neighbors looked at one another differently. Men who had once shared tools now wondered about alibis. Families locked doors at night, something that had rarely been necessary before. The killer had not broken in, he had not smashed a window, he had entered quietly and left quietly. That detail meant he could do it again. Investigators began examining similarities between the Villisca murders and other axe killings that had occurred between 1911 and 1912 across several Midwestern states. In Colorado Springs, in Kansas, in Louisiana, in Illinois, entire families killed in their beds, axes found inside the homes, mirrors sometimes covered, doors locked from within. No robbery. The pattern was difficult to ignore. Some historians later proposed that Villisca may have been part of a larger series committed by a traveling killer moving along railroad lines. Railroads were the highways of that era. A man could arrive at dusk and leave before sunrise without leaving much trace. He could study neighborhoods, observe routines, select a house that appeared vulnerable. The Moore home sat near the rail line, close enough for someone to enter town unnoticed and depart before dawn. He struck primarily from above, often aiming for the head, the blunt side first to avoid blood spray too early, then the blade. This was not random flailing, it was technique. The Reverend George Kelly case became a cautionary example. Another unsettling detail was the positioning of Lena Stillinger. She was found partially uncovered, unlike the other victims whose faces were covered. Some investigators speculated that the killer may have hesitated.
the killer's decision to cover mirrors continues to fascinate criminologists. Was it superstition, a belief in spirits, or the idea that souls remain near mirrors after death? Or was it practical, to prevent accidental reflection of himself in low light? The covering of mirrors required time. The bacon on the stove, the plate in the attic, the bowl of bloody water. These small domestic details amplify the horror, because they suggest the killer felt no urgency. He may have eaten inside the house after killing 8 people. He may have rested, listened, ensured silence before leaving. When dawn approached, he likely walked out the same way he entered. The front door was locked from inside when discovered, the back door too. Years later, the Moore house became an object of fascination. Stories of unexplained sounds emerged, footsteps, doors closing. The Villisca axe murders endure not because of courtroom drama, they endure because of absence. No identified killer, no motive confirmed, no closure. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the fear is not loud, it is subtle. It is the idea that someone could enter a wooden house while everyone sleeps, stand over a bed, lift an axe, and leave before sunrise. No fingerprints preserved, no photographs in newspapers capturing the suspect, just memory and speculation. In the end, Villisca became more than a crime. It became a symbol of vulnerability, of how safety can be illusion, of how a town can carry a question for over a century without answer. In the years after the murders, life in Villisca continued, but it never felt the same, and the Stillinger sisters had only come over for a sleepover. That detail may be the most haunting. Which means the killer either didn't care who was inside, or he didn't know. Imagine the stillness of an attic on a summer night in 1912, waiting until breathing deepens, waiting until the last whisper fades, then descending. It feels like infiltration. For modern listeners, the Villisca axe murders feel almost cinematic. A family went to sleep, a killer entered, 8 lives ended. No one heard enough to stop it. No one saw enough to identify him, and he was never caught. Late at night, when this story settles, the Villisca axe murders remain officially unsolved. A guest room with 2 sisters, an axe leaning against a wall, and morning light revealing what darkness concealed. Entire household erased, no witness, no capture, only memory and silence.
The BTK killer case. A pattern that hid in plain sight. In the mid-1970s, a series of crimes began to unsettle the city of Wichita, Kansas. They did not happen all at once. They were separated by time, and at first they appeared disconnected. Families were attacked inside their homes. There were no signs of forced entry in many cases. The crimes occurred quietly, often at night. Over time, investigators would come to understand that these acts were committed by a single individual. He would later become known as the BTK Killer. The name came from the words he used to describe his actions: bind, torture, kill. The person responsible was Dennis Rader. For decades, he remained unidentified. Dennis Rader was born in 1945 and raised in Kansas. To neighbors and co-workers, he appeared ordinary. He held steady employment. He was involved in his church. He lived a quiet suburban life. Nothing about his public image suggested criminal activity. The first known attacks attributed to BTK occurred in 1974. A family was found killed inside their home. There were no witnesses. There was little physical evidence. Police struggled to understand how the crime had been committed without alerting neighbors. Then, months later, another incident occurred. And then another. As patterns emerged, investigators realized they were dealing with a serial offender. The crimes shared similarities. The suspect appeared to plan in advance. He targeted residential homes. He waited for opportunities. The offender showed knowledge of the neighborhoods. In some cases, he entered homes without drawing attention. In others, he communicated with victims before the attack. Despite these similarities, identifying the suspect proved difficult. There were no reliable eyewitnesses. Forensic technology at the time was limited. The crimes left communities fearful. Residents changed routines. People locked doors more carefully. Trust eroded quietly. Then something unexpected happened. The killer began communicating with the media and police. Letters arrived. In them, the writer described the crimes. He demanded attention. He referred to himself using the initials BTK. These communications confirmed what investigators already suspected. The crimes were connected. The person responsible wanted to be known, but he did not want to be caught. After a period of activity, the crimes stopped. Years passed without new attacks. The case went cold. The name BTK remained, but the person behind it disappeared into anonymity. For nearly 3 decades, there were no confirmed communications. No new crimes linked definitively to the same offender. Investigators kept the case open. Files were reviewed periodically, but without new evidence, progress was limited. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader continued his life. He married, he raised children, he remained active in his community. No arrest was made. The BTK killer became a case discussed in law enforcement circles as an example of how offenders can blend into everyday life. Then, in the early 2000s, something changed. After years of silence, new communications began to arrive. Letters referencing old crimes were sent to the media. The tone was familiar. The style matched earlier messages. The BTK killer had returned. What followed would transform a decades-old cold case into a modern investigation. As the new letters arrived, investigators recognized patterns they had not seen in decades. The language matched earlier communications. The references aligned with details that had never been released publicly. The writer demonstrated knowledge that only the offender would possess. Law enforcement treated the renewed contact seriously. This time, however, the tools available were different. Advances in forensic science, data analysis, and digital tracking allowed investigators to examine details that would have been impossible to analyze years earlier. The letters were carefully studied. Envelopes were examined. Postmarks were recorded. The timing and locations of mailings were mapped. The writer appeared confident. In his messages, he sought recognition and control. He referenced past crimes and taunted authorities. But he also made mistakes. In one communication, the writer asked a question. He wanted to know whether a floppy disk could be traced. Police responded publicly, stating that it could not. The writer trusted the response. He sent a disk. When investigators examined it, they found metadata that had not been erased. The data led them to a computer used at a local church. From there, attention narrowed to an individual who fit the profile investigators had developed years earlier. Dennis Rader. Rader was questioned. During the interview, investigators presented evidence methodically. They referenced the communications. They referenced the disc. They referenced details only the offender would know. Rader eventually admitted responsibility. He provided detailed accounts of the crimes. His statements aligned with evidence collected decades earlier. In 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The arrest shocked the community. People who had known him struggled to reconcile the image of a quiet neighbor with the admissions made in court. The legal proceedings moved forward. Rader chose to plead guilty. During hearings, he described his actions in a factual, detached manner. There was no attempt to dispute responsibility. The court reviewed each case individually. Victim impact statements were presented. Families spoke about years of loss, fear, and unanswered questions. The court sentenced Dennis Rader to multiple life sentences. He would never be eligible for parole. For Wichita and surrounding communities, the arrest marked the end of a long period of uncertainty. A case that had defined fear for an entire generation was finally resolved. But the resolution did not erase the impact. The crimes had altered lives. They had changed how people viewed safety in their own homes. They had demonstrated how an offender could hide behind normal routines for decades. The case also highlighted how investigative persistence and technological progress can intersect. Evidence preserved for years became decisive when paired with new methods. What once seemed unsolvable was resolved through careful, incremental work. After the sentencing, the BTK case moved from investigation into record. The crimes were no longer unresolved. The identity was known. The timeline was complete. For many families, the conclusion came decades after the loss itself. Some had waited most of their lives to hear accountability spoken aloud in court. Others had lived with uncertainty for so long that resolution felt unfamiliar. The guilty plea removed the need for prolonged trials. It also removed ambiguity. Dennis Rader would spend the rest of his life in prison. The case became a reference point for law enforcement. It demonstrated how offenders can maintain ordinary public lives while committing serious crimes in private. It also showed how long gaps in criminal activity can cause investigations to stall, even when patterns exist. Most importantly, it illustrated how mistakes made years later can undo decades of concealment. The single decision to communicate again reopened the case. Technology that did not exist when the crimes were committed became decisive. A simple piece of digital data connected a long, cold case to a real person. From that point, the investigation moved quickly. What had taken decades to uncover was resolved in months. The BTK case also changed how future investigations were approached. Preservation of evidence became a priority. Cold cases were reevaluated with new methods. Communication strategies with offenders were reconsidered. The case reminded investigators that time does not always protect those who believe they have escaped notice. For the public, the story left a lasting impression. Not because of how the crimes were described, but because of how long the truth remained hidden. A person trusted in everyday settings had carried out actions that contradicted his public identity. That contradiction is what many people remember. Late at night, when stories like this are played quietly, the focus often shifts away from the specifics and toward the passage of time. How long fear can last without answers. How slowly some truths surface. How resolution, when it comes, is often quieter than expected. The BTK case did not end with a dramatic confrontation. It ended with records, testimony, and a sentence read aloud in court. For victims and families, that was not closure, but it was finality. The case now exists as a documented history, a reminder of persistence, a reminder of patience, and a reminder that some stories take decades to finish. If you've listened through this case, you've followed a pattern that hid in plain sight for years. If the detail stayed with you, or if something about the timeline stood out, you're welcome to reflect on it. Quiet consideration is often how long cases finally settle. If this calm, late-night approach to documented crime is something you return to, more cases will follow. There is no urgency, no emphasis on shock, just another case, carefully traced from uncertainty to accountability as the night continues. Thank you for listening.
Around 3:30 a.m. on February 14th, 2000, during a cold storm in North Carolina, a 9-year-old girl was walking alone along Highway 18. Rain fell steadily. Wind pushed against trees lining the road. Headlights from passing trucks briefly illuminated a small figure on the shoulder. Drivers later said they thought it was strange, a child at that hour, in that weather. But by the time anyone fully processed what they were seeing, she had stepped off the road and into darkness. Her name was Asha Degree, and she has never been found. She lived with her parents and older brother in a modest home in Shelby. By all accounts, her upbringing was stable. 2-parent household, church involvement, school attendance consistent, no known history of running away, no documented behavioral red flags. The night before she vanished was ordinary. February 13th had been a Sunday. The family attended church. Later that evening, there was a minor power outage due to the storm. Candles were lit briefly. The children went to bed around 8 or 9 p.m. Asha shared a bedroom with her brother. Sometime between 2:30 and 3:15 a.m., she quietly left the house. The front door did not show signs of forced entry. She did not wake her brother. She did not alert her parents. She took a small backpack with her. Inside that backpack, investigators would later learn, were personal items, clothing, a pencil, possibly a book. Intentional packing, not accidental wandering. Her father checked on the children around 2:30 a.m. He later stated that both appeared to be asleep. At approximately 6:30 a.m., her mother went to wake the children for school and discovered Asha was gone. The search began immediately. Family members called relatives. Neighbors were contacted. Within hours, law enforcement was involved. Then came the highway sightings. 2 separate motorists reported seeing a small child walking south along Highway 18 in the early morning hours. One driver turned his truck around out of concern. As he approached, the child ran off the road into nearby woods. He did not pursue further, assuming perhaps it was a domestic situation.
By the time reports reached police, daylight had broken. Search teams were deployed. Dogs tracked scent from the house to the road, then lost it. The woods near the highway were combed. No immediate trace, no body, no clear sign of abduction at the roadside. The storm complicated evidence collection. Rain washes footprints. Wind disrupts scent trails. If someone had been waiting in a vehicle, tire impressions could have been obscured, but investigators found no conclusive physical evidence at that time. The backpack became central. Nearly 18 months later, in August 2001, construction workers uncovered a black plastic trash bag buried off Highway 18, roughly 26 miles north of Shelby. Inside was Asha's backpack. It had been double wrapped in plastic, preserved intentionally. The location suggested concealment. Someone had transported it. Someone had taken time to hide it. The items inside were reportedly intact: clothing, personal effects. There were also items not immediately linked to her household, including a library book from her school. The discovery shifted the case. It indicated that whatever happened after she left the road involved another person. 9-year-olds do not bury their own belongings miles away. But before investigators reached that conclusion, they had to understand the departure itself. Why would a child leave a warm home during a storm without coat preparation for extended exposure, without waking anyone? No note was found, no confirmed prior threats, no known grooming contact identified publicly. The family maintained that Asha had never run away before. She was described as shy, responsible, afraid of the dark, according to some accounts, which made the image of her walking alone before dawn even more unsettling. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the tension rests in that moment of departure, the quiet sound of a door closing, a small backpack over one shoulder, rain tapping against siding, the highway stretching south. The power outage earlier that night may have disrupted routine. Candles, temporary darkness. Did that influence her sleep? Did something wake her? Or was this planned? Investigators examined school life, friend circles, church connections. No evidence of conflict surfaced publicly, no clear signs of coercion. But child abduction cases often hinge on subtle contact, a conversation, a promise, a perceived adventure. It is documented that Asha had checked out books from her school library about adventure and exploration shortly before her disappearance. But reading about adventure is common among children. It does not equal intent to leave. The highway sightings remain some of the most chilling elements of the case. 2 independent witnesses, both describing a small child walking along the roadside. One driver confirmed she ran into the woods when approached. That detail suggests fear of adult strangers, which complicates abduction theory. If she feared unknown drivers, why leave home voluntarily? Unless she believed she was meeting someone specific. But there is no confirmed public evidence identifying such a person. The search in Shelby intensified in the days after she vanished. Volunteers, law enforcement, media coverage regionally. But without ransom demand, without body, without vehicle identification, the case drifted into uncertainty. The backpack discovery in 2001 revived national attention. The fact that it had been double wrapped in plastic implied intentional preservation. Someone wanted it hidden, not discarded carelessly. That detail suggested planning beyond impulsive harm. Years passed. The case remained active, but unresolved.
Periodic tips surfaced. Age-progressed images were released. Investigators publicly maintained that they believed she had encountered another individual after leaving the road, but they did not disclose full evidentiary details. And so the mystery holds two layers. Why did she leave, and who took her? In the days after Asha Degree disappeared from her home in Shelby, investigators focused on two parallel tracks: the departure and the highway. The departure raised questions about planning. Asha had packed a backpack. Inside were clothing items and personal belongings. She did not take a heavy coat suitable for prolonged exposure. She did not leave a note. There was no forced entry into the home, no evidence of struggle inside. Her parents cooperated fully with investigators. Polygraph tests were administered. Extended family was questioned. No charges were filed against family members. The highway sightings remained central. Two truck drivers independently reported seeing a young girl walking along Highway 18 between approximately 3:45 and 4:15 a.m. One described her wearing light-colored clothing. Another said she appeared to be carrying a bag. When one driver turned his vehicle around to check on her, she reportedly ran into the woods. That detail matters. It suggests she was avoiding unknown adults, which complicates theories that she was lured into a random passing car immediately. Search teams combed the woods along that stretch of road. They found a small shed belonging to a nearby property. Inside, investigators located candy wrappers and a pencil. Some reports suggested that these items may have been linked to Asha, though definitive public confirmation has always been limited. If she sheltered briefly in that shed, it suggests she was attempting to hide from passing vehicles. The weather that night was severe: cold rain, strong wind, temperatures near freezing. Exposure risk increases quickly for a child in those conditions, yet no body was located in the immediate search radius. Tracking dogs followed her scent from the house to the highway. Then it disappeared. Scent loss on pavement is common, but investigators also considered the possibility that she entered a vehicle at that point. The backpack discovery in 2001 intensified that theory. When construction workers uncovered the plastic-wrapped bag roughly 26 miles north of Shelby, the distance changed the scale of the case. A 9-year-old could not reasonably cover that distance alone overnight. The bag had been intentionally buried, double-wrapped in trash bags, preserved. It did not appear weathered or scattered. It appeared concealed. Investigators did not publicly release every item recovered from the backpack, but they confirmed it contained personal belongings. The burial site was not a random roadside debris. It was deliberate placement. That detail indicates involvement of another person after she left the highway. Over the years, law enforcement periodically released new pieces of information. In 2016, the FBI publicly mentioned a possible vehicle of interest, an older model green Lincoln Continental or Ford Thunderbird from the 1970s or early 1980s. Witnesses may have seen such a vehicle in the area during the early morning hours. This lead did not result in public arrest, but it suggested investigators believed Asha may have entered or been placed into a car matching that description. The absence of ransom demand complicates motive assessment. Child abduction cases often fall into categories: family-related, opportunistic stranger, grooming-related, or accidental harm followed by concealment. In this case, no public evidence has confirmed grooming, no documented online communication, though the year 2000 predates widespread household internet use, no known prior attempt to run away. Her teachers described her as quiet and responsible. Her family described her as cautious. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the tension rests in contradiction. A child reportedly afraid of the dark, walking alone during a storm, avoiding a truck driver who tried to help, but possibly entering a different vehicle later. Was she meeting someone specific? Did someone in her environment build trust slowly? Authorities have stated they believe Asha left her home voluntarily that night.
That conclusion is based on the lack of forced entry and the presence of packed belongings. But voluntary departure does not mean voluntary disappearance. Children can be manipulated, promises can be made, instructions can be given quietly. The key unknown remains motive for leaving. Her family has consistently stated that Asha had no history of running away. She was described as obedient. She had an upcoming basketball game. She had attended church the previous day. Nothing outward suggested preparation for permanent flight. One documented detail often mentioned in media coverage is that Asha had recently checked out books from her school library involving adventure themes. But reading about adventure is common among children. Investigators have never publicly stated that those books directly influenced her departure.
The backpack discovery remains the strongest physical indicator of outside involvement. Double wrapped in plastic, buried miles away. The act of burial implies time and deliberation. It was not tossed from a moving vehicle, it was concealed. That concealment may suggest someone attempting to remove evidence rather than destroy it. In 2018, and again in later years, law enforcement conducted additional searches in and around Cleveland County, North Carolina. Specific properties were searched based on tips. Some were described as credible. None resulted in public charges. The FBI has continued to list the case as active. A reward remains in place for information leading to resolution. The green vehicle lead from 2016 remains one of the more concrete public details. Authorities referenced a dark green early 1970s Lincoln Continental Mark IV or similar model. The vehicle was reportedly seen in the area the morning she disappeared. Investigators have not disclosed whether the vehicle's driver was ever identified. Vehicle-based abduction remains one plausible scenario, supported by scent loss at the highway and the backpack's relocation distance. But no confirmed suspect has been named publicly. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the emotional weight comes from the absence of finality. There was no ransom demand, no confirmed body, no confession. Just a storm, a highway, a buried backpack. The case has endured in part because of that visual. A 9-year-old child walking along a dark road in heavy rain. Truck headlights passing. A child running into woods when approached. That image resists easy explanation. The long-term impact on her family has been visible through public statements. They have maintained hope, participated in awareness campaigns, marked anniversaries publicly. But hope in missing child cases exists alongside uncertainty, and uncertainty is heavy. For Shelby residents, February 14th carries layered meaning: Valentine's Day, and the anniversary of a disappearance that never resolved. Over the decades, law enforcement has emphasized that someone likely knows more than they have shared. Cases involving concealed evidence often hinge on secondary knowledge: a relative noticing unusual behavior, a vehicle appearing suddenly and then disappearing, a buried bag discovered by accident. Time does not erase secrets completely, but it does complicate retrieval. As of today, no public arrest has been made in connection with Asha's disappearance. No official cause of death has been declared. No location of remains has been identified. And so the case exists suspended between departure and disappearance, between what is known and what is withheld. More than 20 years after Asha Degree walked away from her home in Shelby, North Carolina, the road where she was last seen looks unchanged. Highway 18 still carries early morning traffic,
Storms still move through in February. Headlights still cut through darkness. The difference is invisible. It exists in memory. For the Degree family, time has not closed the story. It has stretched it. Each year brings another anniversary, another age-progressed image, another reminder that absence does not fade quietly. Investigators have maintained that the case remains active. Evidence collected in 2000 was preserved. The backpack recovered in 2001 remains a central artifact. It was not destroyed, it was not lost, it was not casually discarded. It was buried, double-wrapped in plastic, hidden with intent. That single act, concealment, remains one of the clearest indicators that another person was involved after she left the road. The question is, who and why? Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the tension rests in that narrow window between 3:30 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. A door opens quietly, a backpack slung over one shoulder, rain falling, wind pushing against trees, a small figure walking south along Highway 18. Two independent drivers notice her. One turns around. She runs into the woods, and then silence. If she entered a vehicle voluntarily, she may have believed she was meeting someone she trusted. If she was forced into a vehicle, it likely happened quickly. The scent trail ended at the roadside. That detail has never been publicly contradicted. The green vehicle lead, released years later, suggests investigators have focused attention on a possible driver in the area. But without public arrest, that lead remains unresolved. No confirmed remains have been located. No public confession has been announced. No ransom demand was ever made. The case does not provide an ending. It provides an image, and images linger. A child alone in a storm, a buried backpack miles away, a family waiting for answers. Missing child cases carry a different kind of weight than solved homicides. They do not allow grief to settle into certainty. They leave space for possibility, both hopeful and devastating. For Shelby, North Carolina, February 14th is not only a holiday, it is the date a 9-year-old vanished. The town continues to mark it. Law enforcement continues to encourage tips. Rewards remain in place. Somewhere in the layers of memory across Cleveland County and beyond, there may be someone who saw something and did not realize its importance at the time. A vehicle parked where it should not have been. A person acting unusually in the days after. A bag buried in haste. Time complicates memory, but it does not erase physical truth. The backpack was placed deliberately. That fact stands. Everything else branches from it. Why leave home? Who was waiting, if anyone? Where did the journey end? In the quiet hours, when houses settle and storms roll through the Carolinas, the image returns. A small figure walking into darkness. And a case that remains open. Thank you for listening.
1970s, a series of crimes began quietly in California. They did not start with headlines. They did not begin with a known suspect. At first, they appeared unrelated. Homes were entered at night. Victims reported being watched. Personal items were moved. Then the crimes escalated. Over the next several decades, investigators would eventually link dozens of attacks, burglaries, and murders to a single individual. The person responsible would later become known as the Golden State Killer. His real name was Joseph James DeAngelo. For years, he was unidentified. Joseph DeAngelo was born in 1945. He served in the United States Navy and later worked as a police officer in California. During this time, he lived a life that appeared ordinary. He had a job, he had a family. He blended into his community. Meanwhile, a pattern of crimes was developing across multiple regions of the state. In Northern California, a series of burglaries occurred. In Central California, a string of assaults followed. Later, in Southern California, several murders were committed. At the time, these crimes were investigated separately. Different jurisdictions handled different cases. There was no immediate reason to believe they were connected. Victims described similar behaviors. The intruder often entered homes at night. He appeared prepared. He moved deliberately. He avoided detection. In many cases, the attacker left behind little physical evidence. As years passed, law enforcement began to notice similarities. The timing of the crimes, the methods used, the way victims described the suspect's behavior. Gradually, investigators began to consider the possibility that a single person was responsible. This theory would take decades to confirm. The crimes spanned from the mid-1970s into the 1980s. They occurred across hundreds of miles. Some victims survived and provided statements. Others did not. Because of the length of time and the number of locations involved, the investigation faced significant challenges. Evidence was limited. Technology was less advanced. Communication between departments was slower. As a result, the suspect remained unidentified. The case became one of the most complex unsolved crime patterns in California history. Years passed. The attacks stopped. No arrest was made. The suspect faded from public attention. But the case never closed. Advances in forensic science would later change that. In the decades after the crimes, DNA evidence collected from multiple scenes was preserved. Investigators continued to review the case periodically. They revisited old reports. They re-examined evidence. Still, no suspect emerged. It was not until the late 2010s that a breakthrough occurred. Using advances in genetic genealogy, investigators were able to compare crime scene DNA to publicly available genealogy databases. This approach was new. It had never been used successfully in a case of this scale. The results narrowed the field. Family trees were built. Relatives were identified. Eventually, investigators focused on one individual, Joseph James DeAngelo. He was living quietly in California. He was in his 70s. He had not been publicly connected to the crimes. In 2018, DeAngelo was arrested. The announcement marked the end of one of the longest-running unsolved crime investigations in the country. For victims and families, the arrest brought answers that had been delayed for decades. The legal process that followed would examine the evidence carefully, case by case. The crimes were no longer a mystery, but the impact of what had happened remained. As investigators prepared their case, they faced an unusual challenge. The crimes attributed to the Golden State Killer spanned more than a decade and involved multiple jurisdictions across California. Some incidents had occurred in the 1970s, others in the early 1980s. Each had its own reports, evidence files, and victims. Bringing them together into a single legal case required careful reconstruction. Prosecutors began by reviewing preserved DNA evidence collected from various crime scenes. Despite the passage of time, The genetic material was sufficient to establish a link between the crimes. This confirmation allowed investigators to connect incidents that had once been treated as separate cases. The evidence showed a consistent pattern. The same individual had committed burglaries, assaults, and murders across different regions. This pattern explained why the suspect had remained unidentified for so long. He moved frequently. He changed locations. He adapted his behavior. As the investigation continued, details of the suspect's past came into focus. Records confirmed that he had worked in law enforcement during part of the period when the crimes were committed. This fact raised difficult questions. It explained his familiarity with police procedures. It explained how he avoided detection. And it explained how he blended into communities without drawing attention. For victims, this revelation was deeply unsettling. During court proceedings, prosecutors outlined the scope of the crimes. They described how the suspect had targeted homes at night. They explained how he prepared in advance. They detailed how victims were selected and how he avoided leaving obvious evidence. Throughout the presentation, the focus remained factual and restrained. The goal was not to sensationalize, but to establish accountability. Victim impact statements were later presented. Survivors spoke about the long-term effects of the crimes. Families of those who did not survive described the years of uncertainty and loss. For many, the arrest came after decades of waiting. Some had believed they would never see the case resolved. The defendant did not contest the evidence. In 2020, he entered guilty plea to multiple charges, including murder and other serious crimes. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. The court accepted the plea agreement. During sentencing, the judge reviewed the scale of the crimes, the impact across communities, the number of lives affected, the length of time the offender remained unidentified. The sentence reflected the seriousness of those actions: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For many victims and families, the conclusion of the case provided a measure of closure. Not relief from what had happened, but an end to uncertainty. The crimes had names. They had a person held responsible. The Golden State Killer was no longer an unknown presence. He was a documented offender, accountable under the law. Yet even with a legal resolution, the case left lasting questions. How many opportunities had existed to stop the crimes earlier? How did systemic limitations allow the pattern to continue? These questions are now part of the historical record. The case also marked a turning point in criminal investigation. The use of genetic genealogy demonstrated how advances in technology could reopen cases once thought unsolvable. Since then, similar methods have been applied to other cold cases across the country. Some have been resolved, others remain open. The legacy of this case is not only in its resolution, but in how it changed investigative practice, and in how it reminded the public that time does not always erase accountability. When the sentencing concluded, the Golden State Killer case moved from investigation into record. The court proceedings were over. The identity was confirmed. The timeline was documented. For many victims and families, the outcome did not erase what had happened. It did not restore lost years or undo harm, but it did end a long period of uncertainty. Some survivors had waited more than 40 years to hear a name spoken in a courtroom. Others had lived with unanswered questions for most of their lives. The resolution brought a form of acknowledgement. Not justice as a feeling, but accountability as a fact. The case also became a reminder of how criminal investigations evolve. At the time the crimes were committed, technology was limited. DNA analysis was in its early stages. Information sharing between departments was inconsistent. Decades later, those limitations no longer defined the outcome. Preserved evidence, patient review, and advances in science changed what was possible. The method used to identify the suspect opened new paths for unresolved cases across the country. Cold cases, once considered permanent, began to be re-examined. Some were solved, others remain open. The Golden State Killer case now sits at the intersection of past and present. It represents both the failures of earlier systems and the potential of modern investigation. It also stands as a record of how long harm can remain hidden in plain sight. For the communities affected, the case is remembered not for spectacle, but for endurance. For the investigators who never stopped reviewing the files, it is a lesson in persistence. For the public, it is a reminder that resolution does not always come quickly. Sometimes it arrives decades later, quietly, through work that never made headlines. Late at night, when stories like this are played without interruption, the focus often shifts away from the individual details and toward the passage of time. How long events remain unresolved, how long people wait for answers, how accountability can be delayed but not always denied. Crimes committed by the Golden State Killer spanned years and locations. Their impact spanned generations. The conclusion of the case does not close that history, but it does complete the record. If you've listened through this case, you've followed a pattern that took decades to identify and even longer to stop. If a moment or detail stayed with you, you're welcome to reflect on it. Quiet consideration is often how long stories settle. If this calm, late-night approach to documented cases is something you return to, more will follow. There is no urgency, no emphasis on shock, just another case, carefully traced from uncertainty to resolution as the night continues. Thank you for listening.
1982, a woman vanished from a quiet home.
Time, legal counsel, controlled narrative, patience. Kathy was declared legally dead years later, but her body was never found. The disappearance remained unresolved. For nearly 2 decades, it sat quietly until another death connected back to the same man. In December 2000, in Los Angeles, a woman named Susan Berman was found shot in her home, execution style, a single bullet to the back of the head. Susan had been a longtime friend of Robert Durst. She had reportedly helped manage media attention around Kathy's disappearance years earlier. The timing of her murder was notable. Los Angeles authorities had reopened inquiry into Kathy's disappearance. Susan was scheduled to speak with investigators. Then she was killed. The connection tightened scrutiny. Durst denied involvement, but the pattern was forming. Missing wife, close friend executed before police interview. Still, no charges were filed against him for those deaths at that time. The story might have remained fragmented if not for a third event. In 2001, in Galveston, police arrested a mute woman named Dorothy Siner. But Dorothy was Robert Durst in disguise. He had been living in a modest apartment under that alias. In that same apartment complex, a neighbor named Morris Black was found dismembered, his body parts placed in garbage bags and scattered into Galveston Bay. Durst admitted to cutting up the body, but he claimed self-defense. He said Morris Black had confronted him, that a struggle ensued, that he panicked, and that the dismemberment was fear-driven, not murderous. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the unsettling pattern becomes clearer. A wife disappears, a friend is shot, a neighbor is dismembered, and in each instance, Robert Durst stands at the center. Yet in 2003, he was acquitted of murder in Texas. The jury accepted the self-defense argument. The admission of dismemberment did not produce a conviction. The man who admitted cutting up a body walked free. The pattern did not disappear, it deepened. Durst returned to New York, continued living under public suspicion, but not conviction. Then came the documentary. In 2015, HBO aired The Jinx, a series examining Durst's life and the suspicious deaths surrounding him. Filmmakers interviewed him extensively. He appeared composed, even amused at times. But during filming, after what he believed was the end of an interview, he entered a bathroom still wearing a live microphone. He muttered words that would echo worldwide. "They're all dead, of course." The audio was debated, interpreted, parsed, but its impact was immediate. The timing of his arrest was equally striking. On the eve of the documentary's final episode airing, authorities arrested Robert Durst in New Orleans. He was later extradited to face charges related to Susan Berman's murder in Los Angeles. After decades of evasion, the legal pressure finally crystallized. But rewind to 1982, to South Salem, to a young medical student who vanished. The story does not begin with a confession. It begins with absence, a husband's calm demeanor, a family's wealth, a missing woman, and silence stretching across decades. After the 1982 disappearance of Kathy Durst in South Salem, investigators struggled with absence. No body, no crime scene, no clear forensic anchor. But absence does not erase suspicion. Friends of Kathy later described a marriage marked by volatility, arguments, reports of physical altercations, claims that she had once sought medical treatment for injuries allegedly inflicted by her husband. None of those claims alone produced criminal charges at the time, and Robert Durst's family resources allowed for controlled legal navigation. Over the next 18 years, the case remained technically open but inactive. Kathy was eventually declared legally dead in 2017, decades after her disappearance. But long before that declaration, another death reactivated scrutiny. In December 2000, in Los Angeles, a woman named Susan Berman was found shot in her home, execution style. a single bullet to the back of the head. Susan had been a longtime friend of Robert Durst. She had reportedly helped manage media attention around Kathy's disappearance years earlier. The timing of her murder was notable. Los Angeles authorities had reopened inquiry into Kathy's disappearance. Susan was scheduled to speak with investigators. Then she was killed.
When New York investigators reopened aspects of the 1982 case in 2000, Susan was reportedly scheduled to speak with them. Then she was killed. Los Angeles police suspected a targeted execution. A handwritten note had been mailed to police shortly before the body was discovered, containing Berman's address. The note's handwriting would later become a key piece of forensic evidence. Investigators eventually compared that note to a letter Durst had written years earlier. The similarities became central to prosecution decades turned to relative obscurity. But the cases never fully dissipated. Investigators in New York continued reviewing Kathy's disappearance. Los Angeles detectives preserved evidence in the Berman case. Handwriting analysis matured. DNA testing advanced. Time, in some cases, strengthens forensic capability rather than weakens it. Then came the documentary. The Jinx aired in 2015. Filmmakers had spent years interviewing Durst. He participated willingly, perhaps believing he could outmaneuver narrative. During the final episode, footage captured him entering a bathroom after an interview, still wearing a live microphone. He muttered phrases interpreted as confession. "They're all dead, of course. What the hell did I do? Kill them all, of course." Durst later claimed he was speaking hypothetically, but the audio reignited law enforcement urgency. On March 14, 2015, he was arrested in New Orleans. This time, charges centered on the 2000 murder of Susan Berman. The trial moved to trial years later. Handwriting analysis linked him to the note mailed to police. Circumstantial evidence connected motive to preventing her from speaking with investigators. In 2021, he was convicted of Berman's murder in Los Angeles. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in custody in 2022. But rewind again to 1982, because the center of the pattern remains Kathy.
Her body has never been found. No definitive crime scene has been located. No murder conviction was obtained for her disappearance. The legal resolution came through the Berman case, but the emotional origin rests in South Salem. A young woman. Her execution-style killing suggested silencing. The handwritten note mailed to police with her address was crucial. Handwriting analysts later testified that the cadaver note matched Durst's writing. Misspellings aligned, letter formations aligned. It became one of the strongest physical anchors in the decades-long saga. But even then, it took years to assemble prosecutable structure. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the unsettling element is patience, not impulsive rage, but patient survival.
Durst did not unravel quickly. He adjusted identities, moved states, adopted disguises. In Texas, he lived as a woman under an alias, paid rent in cash, maintained low profile. The dismemberment of Morris Black was brutal, but even that did not end his freedom immediately. In court, his defense reframed the narrative. They emphasized lack of direct proof of premeditation. They argued panic. They leaned into the idea that shocking behavior after death does not prove intent before it. The jury agreed. Acquittal. That moment reinforced a public perception. He could evade consequence. But evasion requires vigilance, and vigilance eventually fatigues. The documentary The Jinx altered the landscape, not because it introduced new forensic evidence immediately, but because it reshaped public awareness. It forced long-ignored patterns into mainstream attention. Durst's decision to participate remains psychologically intriguing. Why agree to extended interviews about unresolved murders? Confidence? Narcissism? Belief in intellectual superiority?
He moved states, adopted aliases, survived trial, maintained composure. In the Texas case, he admitted to dismembering a body and was acquitted of murder. That verdict reinforced public perception that he could survive anything. But legal systems move unevenly, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. The handwritten cadaver note in the Berman case became the hinge. Misspellings consistent with his earlier writing, structure consistent. The decision to mail her address to police became self-incriminating evidence decades later. And then there was the microphone moment, the bathroom, the muttered words. Whether interpreted as confession or fragmented thought, it shifted momentum. Public attention intensified, prosecutors accelerated, and the arc bent toward conviction. But remove the documentary, remove the microphone, and the pattern remains. A wife disappears, a confidant is executed, a neighbor is dismembered. In each case, proximity aligns with Durst. The narrative is less about sudden eruption and more about endurance. How long can ambiguity survive without anchor? How long can suspicion remain circumstantial before hardening into proof? The Durst story became a cultural study in privilege, patience, and forensic evolution. In 1982, digital trails were rare. By 2021, handwriting analysis, timeline reconstruction, and long-preserved evidence created a cumulative structure strong enough to convict. Time does not always weaken cases. Sometimes it refines them. For the families connected to these deaths, resolution is uneven. Susan Berman's case reached verdict. Morris Black's death resulted in acquittal. Kathy Durst's disappearance remains unresolved legally, though widely believed by investigators to have been homicide. The wooded property in South Salem remains. The apartment complex in Galveston still stands. The Los Angeles home where Berman was killed exists within ordinary city rhythm. But those spaces carry memory, not visibly, but historically. When the lights go out and houses settle into silence, the Robert Durst case lingers because it challenges a simple expectation.
In February of 1957, a man walking along a quiet road in Philadelphia made a discovery that would become one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. Inside a discarded cardboard box was the body of a young boy. No identification, no missing person report, no one claiming him. Just a child left behind as if he had never existed at all. Imagine this for a moment. A child is found with no name, no history, no one searching for him. How is that even possible? The boy in the box, as he would later be known, was estimated to be around 4 to 6 years old. He was found in a wooded area, wrapped in a blanket, placed inside a cardboard box that had once contained a baby bassinet. The location wasn't remote enough to hide something forever, but it was quiet enough to delay discovery. From the very beginning, something about the case felt deeply unsettling, not just because of what had happened,
but because of what was missing. No one had reported a child like him missing. No family came forward, no school records, no neighbors, nothing. Now think about this. If a child disappears today, it spreads instantly. Alerts, news, social media. But even in 1957, how does a child vanish without anyone noticing? Police began their investigation immediately. They examined the area, collected evidence, took photographs. But the problem wasn't just solving the crime, it was identifying the victim. Because without a name, there was no starting point. Investigators released images. They shared details with the public. They asked for help. And the response was overwhelming. Thousands of tips came in. People believed they recognized the boy. Some thought he looked like a neighbor. Others thought he resembled a missing relative. But none of those leads led to a confirmed identity. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still no one came forward to claim him. At this point, ask yourself something. What kind of situation would have to exist for a child to be completely unaccounted for? As investigators looked deeper, they noticed details about the boy that raised even more questions. His hair had been recently cut. There were signs that he had been bathed. His body showed signs of malnourishment. These weren't random details. They suggested a story of a child who had been somewhere, with someone, before he was left in that box. But who? And why had no one ever reported him missing? One of the first major leads came from the box itself. It was traced back to a specific type of bassinet sold in local stores. Investigators hoped that someone might remember purchasing it, but that trail went cold. Then came another clue, the blanket the boy was wrapped in. It was identified as a type commonly produced in the region, but again, no clear link to a specific person. The case continued to grow, not in clarity, in complexity, because every new detail raised more questions than answers. And slowly the case began to change, from an active investigation into a mystery that refused to be solved. But there was one theory, one account that would later draw significant attention. A woman would come forward years later claiming she knew who the boy was and what had happened to him. We'll come back to her story, because if it's true, it changes everything. But before that, there's something else you need to consider. Because sometimes the most important clue in a case isn't what is found, it's what's missing. In the months following the discovery of the boy in the box, investigators continued to search for something, anything that could give the child a name. Because without that, the case couldn't truly move forward. They revisited the scene, the box, the blanket. Every small detail was examined again and again. And one thing became clear. Whoever left the boy there
had taken steps to make identification difficult. There were no personal belongings, no clothing that could be traced easily, no items linking him to a home, a school, or a family. Now think about this. If someone wanted to hide a crime, would removing identity be the first step? Or does it suggest something even darker? Police began expanding their search. They contacted schools, hospitals, adoption agencies, orphanages. They checked missing children reports not just in Philadelphia, but across the country. Still, nothing. It was as if the boy had lived his entire life outside the system.
That idea alone raised troubling questions. Because for a child to remain completely undocumented, he had to be hidden. And if he was hidden, then someone knew about him. Years passed. The case didn't disappear, but it slowed. Occasionally, new leads would surface, a tip, a sighting, a theory, but none of them could be confirmed. Then, decades later, a woman came forward with a story. She claimed that as a child, she had lived in a home where a boy was kept hidden. She described him as small, quiet, and often mistreated. According to her account, the boy had been brought into the home under unclear circumstances. He wasn't treated like a family member, more like someone who wasn't supposed to be seen. She said he was abused, neglected, and kept isolated. Then, one day, something went wrong. She claimed the boy had been fatally injured during an incident involving punishment. After that, his body was placed in a box and abandoned. The details she provided matched certain aspects of the case: the age, the condition, the lack of identification. But there was a problem. Her story couldn't be fully verified. Investigators looked into her claims. They searched for evidence, tried to connect her account to known facts, but there were gaps, missing pieces, no definitive proof linking her story to the boy. Now think about this. If someone gives a detailed account years later, how do you decide if it's truth or a story shaped by memory? Because memory changes over time. Details blur. Events can feel real even when they aren't. Still, her story remained one of the most discussed theories in the case, because it offered something the investigation had lacked for years: a possible explanation. But even that explanation was uncertain. As time went on, the case became one of the most well-known cold cases in the United States. The boy remained unidentified. Investigators continued trying new methods, new technologies, new approaches. Because even decades later, one question remained at the center of everything: who was he? And somewhere in that answer was the truth about what happened to him. We'll come back to the efforts to identify the boy, because they would eventually take a modern turn. A turn involving technology that didn't exist in 1957. And that shift would bring the case closer to an answer than it had ever been before. But before that, there's something else to consider. Because in cases like this, the hardest part isn't always solving the crime. It's restoring identity. For decades, the case of the boy in the box remained suspended in uncertainty. Investigators had exhausted traditional methods. Witnesses faded, memories blurred, leads went cold. But the case was never truly closed, because even as years passed, there was always one goal that remained unchanged: give the boy a name. And as technology advanced, that possibility slowly became more real. Forensic science began to evolve. DNA testing improved. Databases expanded. Methods that didn't exist in 1957 were now capable of answering questions that once seemed impossible. Investigators revisited the evidence, preserved samples, anything that could still be tested. And this time, they weren't just looking for a suspect.
They were looking for identity. Because identifying the boy would unlock everything else.
Now think about this. If you don't know who the victim is, how do you ever truly solve the crime? Years turned into decades, and then, finally, there was a breakthrough. Using advanced DNA analysis and genealogical research, investigators were able to trace family connections, not directly, but through distant relatives. By building a genetic family tree, they began narrowing down possibilities, line by line, generation by generation, until eventually, the boy who had no name was identified. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. For the first time in over 65 years, he was no longer just the boy in the box. He had an identity, a history, a place in the world. But even with that discovery, the case wasn't fully solved, because knowing who he was didn't fully explain what happened to him. Investigators began looking into his background, his family connections, the circumstances of his life, trying to understand how a child could exist and yet remain invisible. Now think about this. How does a child go unnoticed for so long? What kind of environment allows that to happen? Because this case isn't just about a crime, it's about absence. The absence of records, the absence of witnesses, the absence of someone saying, "I know him." And maybe that's what makes this case so different. Not just the mystery of what happened, but the silence that surrounded it. Even today, there is no confirmed account of Joseph's final days, no single version of events that explains everything, only fragments, possibilities, and theories that don't fully connect. And that leaves us with something difficult, a story that is partially resolved but not complete. Because while we now know his name, we still don't fully know his life, or the person responsible for ending it. So now let me ask you something. If a case like this can remain unsolved for decades, even with modern technology, what does that say about how many other stories might still be out there? Stories without answers, without closure, without justice. And one more thing to think about. Now that we finally know his name, do you think this case will ever truly be solved? Or will it remain one of those rare mysteries where the truth is always just out of reach? Because in the end, this case leaves us with something more than just facts. It leaves us with a responsibility to remember, not just the mystery, but the person at the center of it. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a child who was unknown for decades, but is now finally known. Thank you.